When we picture the island of Jamaica, our minds often fill with images of vibrant culture. We see stunning beaches, hear the rhythms of reggae music, and taste the spice of jerk chicken. The history of this island is deeply intertwined with the story of Africa and the transatlantic slave trade. But there is another, much quieter story hidden within Jamaica's past. It is a story that begins not in Africa, but on the green shores of Ireland. It speaks of a time when thousands of Irish men, women, and even children were sent across the Atlantic. They were not tourists. They were not wealthy settlers. They were indentured servants bound to work in the sweltering heat of the Caribbean. This surprising chapter in the histories of both Ireland and Jamaica has been largely forgotten, a footnote in the grand, often brutal narrative of the British Empire. This migration was not a choice for many. It was a consequence of conflict and conquest far away in their homeland. During the 17th century, Ireland was a place of immense turmoil. English military campaigns, particularly under Oliver Cromwell, resulted in the displacement of vast numbers of Irish people. Many were captured in battle or simply rounded up from their villages. They were then transported to the newly acquired English colonies in the Americas, including Jamaica. These individuals were seen as a source of cheap labor, a way to quickly populate the island and make its agricultural ventures profitable. They were a solution to a problem for the English crown, but for the Irish, it was the beginning of an unimaginable ordeal, a forced journey into a world entirely alien to them. Imagine leaving the cool, damp climate of Ireland, a land of rolling green hills and familiar faces. You are then thrust onto a crowded ship, sailing for weeks across a seemingly endless ocean. You arrive in a place where the sun is relentless, the air thick with humidity, and the landscape is dominated by vast fields of sugarcane. This was the reality for the Irish who landed in Jamaica. They were unprepared for the tropical diseases, the back-breaking labor, and the harsh discipline of plantation life. Their story is a poignant reminder that the peopling of the New World was a complex and often cruel process, involving many different groups from many different places, all caught in the web of empire. Understanding this piece of history is not about comparing one group's suffering to another. Instead, it is about adding a layer of complexity to our understanding of the past. It shows us that the colonial system was vast and its methods varied. The Irish in Jamaica were part of a global movement of people, both forced and voluntary, that shaped the world we live in today. Their experiences, though distinct, were part of the same colonial machine that brought enslaved Africans to the same shores. By exploring their forgotten journey, we can begin to see the intricate connections that bind different histories together, creating a more complete and nuanced picture of our shared human story. It is a story that deserves to be brought out of the shadows and into the light. To understand why so many Irish people found themselves in Jamaica, we must travel back to 17th century Ireland. This was a time of great upheaval and violence. The English crown sought to solidify its control over the island, leading to a series of wars and rebellions. The most brutal of these conflicts was the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland in the 1650s. Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector of England, led a ruthless campaign to crush Irish Catholic resistance. His forces swept across the country, leaving devastation in their wake. Entire towns were destroyed and vast swathes of land were confiscated from Irish landowners and given to English soldiers and settlers. This conquest reshaped Irish society forever. The aftermath of the war left thousands of Irish people dispossessed and destitute. Many were left without homes, land, or a way to support their families. The English authorities viewed this large, displaced population as a threat. They were seen as potential rebels, a source of future trouble. The solution, in their eyes, was a policy of mass transportation. People were rounded up, often with little notice or reason. These included captured soldiers, Catholic priests, and ordinary men and women who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. This policy was seen as an effective way to both pacify Ireland and provide labor for the growing colonies in the West Indies. The English had captured Jamaica from the Spanish in 1655, and they were eager to make the island profitable. The primary industry was sugar, a crop that required a huge and constant workforce. While the transatlantic slave trade was already established, The English also looked for other sources of labour. The displaced Irish became a convenient solution. They were shipped to Jamaica and other Caribbean islands, such as Barbados and Montserrat, under contracts of indenture. This was not a voluntary migration, it was a forced removal, a form of exile. For the English, it was a practical matter of colonial administration. For the Irish, it was a traumatic uprooting from their ancestral homeland. This period is often grimly remembered in Irish folk memory with the phrase "to hell" or "to Connaught," referring to the choice given to some landowners to either move to the barren lands of Western Ireland or face death. But for many others, there was a third unspoken option: transportation to the Caribbean. The numbers are difficult to pinpoint with absolute certainty, but historical estimates suggest that tens of thousands of Irish people were sent to the Americas as indentured servants during this era. This forced exodus was a direct result of colonial policy, a brutal chapter in the long and often painful relationship between England and Ireland. It was this policy that first brought a significant Irish presence to the shores of Jamaica. The journey from Ireland to Jamaica was a long and treacherous ordeal. It was a voyage that many did not survive. The people being transported were packed tightly into the dark, foul-smelling holds of merchant ships. These vessels were not designed for passenger comfort. They were cargo ships, and the Irish were treated as little more than human freight. Men, women and children were crammed together in unsanitary conditions, with little food and even less fresh water. The air below deck would have been thick with the stench of sickness, sweat and fear. The journey across the vast Atlantic Ocean could take anywhere from 6 to 12 weeks, depending on the winds and weather. During this long passage, disease was rampant. Sicknesses like dysentery, scurvy and typhus, often called ship fever, could spread like wildfire through the crowded holds. Malnutrition weakened the passengers, making them even more susceptible to illness. Many died before they ever saw the shores of the Caribbean. Their bodies were unceremoniously thrown overboard into the deep blue waters of the ocean. The psychological toll of the voyage must have been immense. These were people who had already endured the trauma of war and displacement. Now they were trapped on a floating prison, heading towards an unknown and terrifying future, thousands of miles from everything they had ever known. For those who survived the crossing, the first glimpse of Jamaica would have been both awe-inspiring and intimidating. After weeks at sea, the sight of a lush, mountainous island rising from the turquoise water must have been a spectacle, but any sense of wonder would have been quickly replaced by apprehension. The heat and humidity would have been a shocking contrast to the cool climate of Ireland. The strange sights, sounds, and smells of a tropical port would have been completely alien. They were stepping into a world for which they were utterly unprepared, a world where their lives would be controlled by others. Upon arrival, they were not free. They were immediately taken to be sold. Their indenture contracts, which bound them to a master for a set number of years, were auctioned off to the highest bidder. Plantation owners and merchants would inspect them, much like they would inspect livestock, before purchasing their labor. Families were often separated at these auctions, with husbands sold to one plantation and wives and children to another. This was the final, heartbreaking act of their forced journey. After surviving war in their homeland and a perilous sea voyage, they arrived in their new home only to be separated from their loved ones and sent to begin a life of hard labor under the brutal Caribbean sun. Life for an Irish indentured servant on a Jamaican sugar plantation was one of relentless, backbreaking work. The sugar industry was the engine of the colonial economy, and it was a notoriously brutal one. The work was physically demanding and dangerous. Servants would spend their days from sunrise to sunset, toiling in the fields under a scorching sun. They planted sugarcane, a tough and labor-intensive crop. At harvest time, they would cut the tall, thick stalks with heavy machetes, a task that often resulted in serious injuries. The work was monotonous and exhausting, a cycle of planting, cutting, and processing that seemed endless. There was little respite from the heat, the humidity, and the swarms of insects. Once the cane was cut, it had to be processed quickly before it spoiled. This meant more grueling work at the sugar mill. The mills were dangerous places, filled with heavy machinery for crushing the cane and massive cauldrons of boiling sugar juice. Servants worked long hours, often through the night during the harvest season, feeding the cane into rollers and tending the boiling vats. Accidents were common. A moment of inattention could lead to a hand or arm being crushed in the rollers or to horrific burns from the scalding liquid. The conditions were harsh, and the work was designed to extract the maximum amount of labor in the shortest possible time. The living conditions for these servants were basic at best. They were typically housed in small, simple huts, often crowded together with little privacy. Their diet was meager, usually consisting of rations of corn, salted fish, and whatever they could grow in small garden plots, if they were allowed them. They were provided with minimal clothing, which quickly wore out in the harsh conditions. Malnutrition and exhaustion made them vulnerable to the many tropical diseases that were prevalent in Jamaica, such as malaria and yellow fever. Many who had survived the voyage across the Atlantic succumbed to illness within their first few years on the island. Their lives were short and filled with hardship. The system of indenture was enforced with strict and often brutal discipline. A master had almost complete control over the life of his servant. Servants could be whipped or beaten for not working hard enough, for being disobedient, or for attempting to run away. Their contracts could be extended as a form of punishment, adding years to their term of service. They were not allowed to leave the plantation without permission and could not marry without their master's consent. While they were legally considered human beings, their daily existence was one of subjugation and control, a life of hard labor from which there was little chance of escape until their term of service was finally complete. So, it's really crucial to understand the distinction between indentured servitude and chattel slavery, since they were legally different systems. An indentured servant, like the Irish in Jamaica, was technically a person with some rights under the law. Their servitude was for a fixed period, usually between 4 and 7 years. At the end of their contract, they were legally free. They were often promised a small plot of land or a payment, something called freedom dues, when they finished their service. In theory, this offered them a chance to one day build a new life as a free person. This finite term of service is honestly the single most important legal difference between indenture and slavery. In contrast, chattel slavery, the system imposed upon Africans brought to Jamaica, was a lifelong and hereditary condition. An enslaved person was not considered a human being with rights, but rather the legal property or chattel of their owner. They could be bought, sold, mortgaged, or inherited, just like a piece of furniture or a farm animal. Their children were born into slavery, inheriting the status of their mother. There was no contract, no term of service, and no promise of freedom. It was a permanent state of bondage designed to last for generations. This complete dehumanization is what made chattel slavery a uniquely cruel and far-reaching institution. However, despite these legal differences, the day-to-day reality for many Irish indentured servants could be, well, shockingly similar to that of the enslaved. They worked in the same fields, often side by side, performing the same grueling tasks. They were subject to the same brutal forms of physical punishment, including whipping and branding. They lived in similar conditions of poverty and were equally susceptible to malnutrition and disease. The masters who owned the plantations often made little distinction in their treatment of the two groups, viewing both simply as sources of labor to be exploited for profit. For an observer watching the work in a cane field, it would have been difficult to tell the servant from the slave based on their labor alone. The line between the two statuses could also become blurred in practice. Abusive masters could easily find reasons to extend a servant's contract, trapping them in servitude for many more years. If a servant ran away and was caught, years could be added to their indenture. If a female servant became pregnant, the time she was unable to work could be added to her term. While the promise of eventual freedom remained, for many, it must have seemed like a distant and unattainable dream. Their experience really demonstrates that even within a system that was not technically slavery, the conditions of life could be almost indistinguishable from it, a brutal reality of exploitation in the colonial world. So what happened to the thousands of Irish who were sent to Jamaica? Why is their presence not more obvious on the island today? Well, the answer lies in a gradual process of assimilation and disappearance over many generations. For those who survived their term of indenture, a new and difficult chapter began. They were now free, but they were also poor and landless in a society with a rigid social hierarchy. The freedom dues they were promised, if they received them at all, were often not enough to establish themselves as independent farmers. The best land was already owned by the wealthy slave-owning plantocracy. Finding themselves on the lowest rung of free society, many former Irish servants had limited options. Some managed to acquire small plots of land in the mountainous interior of the island, away from the large sugar estates. Here they lived as subsistence farmers, a life of poverty, but one of freedom. Others moved to the growing towns and ports like Kingston, where they tried to find workers, artisans, sailors, or tavern keepers. They often lived and worked alongside free people of colour and other poor whites. In these communities, the rigid social lines of the plantation began to blur. Intermarriage between the poor Irish and the free black and mixed-race population became common. This intermingling was a key factor in the gradual fading of a distinct Irish community. As Irish men and women formed families with people of African descent, their children became part of Jamaica's growing mixed-race population. Over generations, their distinctly Irish physical features and cultural traits began to blend into the wider Jamaican society. Surnames like Collins, Murphy, Walsh and McCormick, which are common in Ireland, can still be found throughout Jamaica today. They are a subtle, enduring echo of this forgotten migration. These names are often the only visible trace left of the thousands of Irish who were forced to make the island their home. The Irish who remained in Jamaica did not retain a strong, separate cultural identity in the way that Irish communities did in North America. They did not establish their own churches, schools, or social organizations in the same manner. They were a small minority in a society numerically dominated by people of African descent. Their poverty and low social status meant they lacked the resources to maintain a distinct cultural enclave. Instead, they assimilated. They became Jamaican. Their story is not one of a community that vanished, but of one that was absorbed into the rich, complex fabric of a new nation being forged in the crucible of the Caribbean. Their genetic and cultural legacy is woven into the tapestry of modern Jamaica. The story of Irish indentured servants in Jamaica has been largely forgotten for several complex reasons. One of the primary factors is what we might call the shadow of slavery. The sheer scale and horror of the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery rightly dominate the historical narrative of Jamaica and the wider Caribbean. The enslavement of millions of Africans was an institution of unimaginable brutality that lasted for centuries and fundamentally shaped the island's society, economy, and culture. In the face of this colossal historical event, the story of a smaller group of people who were indentured for a finite period naturally became a secondary storyline. The immense tragedy of slavery cast such a long shadow that other stories of suffering were often obscured. Another reason for its disappearance from popular memory is the lack of a distinct, enduring community. As we have seen, the Irish in Jamaica did not maintain a separate identity. They assimilated, intermarried, and became part of the broader Jamaican population. Unlike in the United States or Canada, where large, visible Irish communities preserved their history through cultural institutions, songs, and stories, the Irish in Jamaica blended into the background. Without a community actively working to keep the memory alive, the story faded with each passing generation. The history became fragmented, reduced to a collection of surnames and place names, rather than a living remembered narrative. The story was also inconvenient for the dominant historical narratives of the time. For the British Empire, the forced transportation of its own subjects was not a chapter it was eager to highlight. It complicated the simple narrative of civilizing a new world. Later, for Irish nationalists, building a story of a nation united against English oppression, the tale of Irish people participating even at the lowest levels in a colonial system built on slavery was also complex. The servants were victims of English colonialism, but they were also part of the colonial project itself. This ambiguity made the story a poor fit for the clear-cut, heroic narratives that nations often prefer to tell about themselves. Finally, there is the simple matter of historical records. The lives of the poor and powerless are often poorly documented. While records of land ownership and the business dealings of wealthy planters are plentiful, the personal stories of individual indentured servants are much harder to find. They were often illiterate and left behind no letters or diaries. Official records might list their name, age, and term of service, but they rarely capture the details of their personal experience. Historians must piece the story together from fragmented court records, plantation ledgers, and official correspondence. This lack of first-hand accounts makes it challenging to bring the story to life and has contributed to its place on the margins of history. Bringing a forgotten story like that of the Irish in Jamaica back into the light is more than just an academic exercise. It is an act of historical recovery that enriches our understanding of the past in profound ways. History is not a single monolithic story. It is a mosaic made up of countless smaller stories. When pieces of that mosaic are missing, our picture of the past is incomplete and distorted. By unearthing these hidden histories, we add depth, nuance, and complexity to our understanding. We begin to see that historical events were experienced differently by different groups of people, and that the lines between victim, perpetrator, and bystander were not always clear. Learning about these forgotten chapters forces us to challenge the simple, black and white narratives we are often taught. The story of colonialism is not just a story of European conquerors and non-European subjects. It is also a story of class, of poverty, and of conflict within European societies themselves. The Irish servants were white and from Europe, but their experience of colonialism was one of dispossession and forced labor, not of conquest and enrichment. Their story complicates our ideas about race and power in the colonial world. It reminds us that the machinery of empire was vast and indiscriminate, capable of exploiting anyone, regardless of their origin, in the pursuit of profit. Furthermore, remembering these stories is an act of respect for the people who lived them. The men, women, and children who were forcibly sent to Jamaica endured immense hardship. Their struggles, their resilience, and their eventual assimilation into a new society are a significant part of the human story. To allow their experience to remain forgotten is to dishonor their memory. By telling their story, we acknowledge their existence and validate their suffering. We recognize them not as mere footnotes in a larger history, but as individuals whose lives had meaning and whose legacy, however subtle, continues to this day. It is a way of giving a voice to those who were silenced by the circumstances of their time. Ultimately, a more inclusive and comprehensive history is a more truthful history. When we actively seek out and listen to the stories that have been marginalized or ignored, we gain a more accurate and honest perspective on how our world came to be. These hidden histories often contain important lessons about power, inequality, and the human capacity for both cruelty and resilience. They connect us to a wider range of human experience and foster a deeper sense of empathy. The story of the Irish in Jamaica is just one of many such hidden histories waiting to be told. Uncovering them is essential work for anyone who believes that a true understanding of the past is vital for building a better future. Remembering the story of Irish indentured servants in Jamaica offers us valuable lessons for our world today, on this day, the 1st of September 2025. It serves as a powerful reminder that migration is often driven by desperation, conflict, and a lack of opportunity. The Irish did not choose to leave their homes. They were forced out by war and poverty. This historical reality mirrors the plight of countless refugees and migrants today, who are compelled to leave their homelands due to violence, political instability, or economic collapse. This story encourages us to look at modern migration with a greater sense of empathy and historical perspective, understanding the powerful forces that can compel people to undertake perilous journeys in search of safety or a better life. This history also teaches us about the complex nature of identity. The Irish in Jamaica eventually became part of the very fabric of the island, their descendants identifying as Jamaican. This process of assimilation and the creation of new hybrid identities is a constant feature of human history. It challenges rigid notions of race and nationality. It shows us that culture is not static. It is fluid, constantly evolving and adapting as different groups of people interact and mix. In a world that is often divided by sharp lines of ethnicity and national origin, the story of the Irish becoming Jamaican is a testament to the ways in which humanity has always found ways to blend and create something new. Moreover, this narrative warns us about the dangers of historical amnesia. The fact that this significant migration could be so thoroughly forgotten demonstrates how easily parts of our collective past can be erased, particularly the stories of the poor and the powerless. It highlights the importance of actively questioning the histories we are taught and seeking out the narratives that have been left out. It reminds us that history is often written by the victors, and that a complete picture requires us to listen for the quieter voices, the whispers from the margins. We must be vigilant in preserving and telling these stories, lest we end up with a skewed and incomplete understanding of who we are and how we got here. In conclusion, the forgotten saga of the Irish in Jamaica is more than a historical curiosity. It is a story about the enduring human spirit, about resilience in the face of unimaginable hardship. It complicates our understanding of colonialism, race and identity. Remembering these Irish servants is not about diminishing the central story of African slavery, but about adding another layer to the intricate and often painful history of the making of the modern world. By remembering them, we honor the full complexity of Jamaica's national motto, "Out of many, one people." We acknowledge that the story of any nation is a chorus of many different voices, and every one of those voices deserves to be heard.